Welcome to Recalibrate Reality, the future of New York. Our guest today is the best-selling author and internationally renowned expert on cities, Richard Florida. Richard is a professor at the University of Toronto School of Cities and a distinguished fellow at NYU's Schack School of Real Estate. He's also the author of two bestsellers, The Rise of the Creative Class and The New Urban Crisis. Richard's research has focused on what makes cities thrive and what makes them fail, a topic that should be important to anyone thinking about the future of New York, particularly in a post-COVID world. And so now, let's recalibrate reality with Richard Florida. Richard, welcome to Recalibrate Reality.
Scott, it's always great to be with you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. And so a year ago, you and I were collaborating together on a white paper, and both of us were bullish on the future of New York. I think the question we had was, how long would it take for New York to recover, and what would it look like on the other side? For me personally, I've been really surprised how quickly New York has bounced back. And so I'm curious to see if you were equally surprised or what your takeaway is now here as we stand a year later.
I knew New York would bounce back. I knew it in my gut. I knew it in my intuition, and I knew it from what I do, studying cities. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen a more resilient city than New York. London's resilient. You know, there are great cities that are resilient, but New York has a resiliency and a spirit that's second to none. And you kind of knew, I went back, and you know this about me. I went back and I read all the history of other pandemics, the Spanish flu, the plagues, all this stuff. And every time, people do decamp. They run away from the plague or the pestilence. But as soon as it's over, they come back. And especially the young people, right? The ambitious people looking to make a life, looking to reconnect. I'll tell you what was interesting to me. I was in New York last week, and it was my first time back because, I live in Toronto now, since before the crisis. And I think I did have one thing wrong. I think I got something wrong. I knew New York would come back, but I think I got how it would come back wrong. I kind of assumed that downtown, nightlife, restaurants, the cultural scene would be the first to come back. And I stayed downtown. I stayed in Soho. And it was great. The little sheds were great with the restaurants. There were people, but it was quiet because there wasn't tourists. But when I went to two dinners at Midtown, and I expected Midtown, the offices are coming back. You're bringing people back, but people are still scared of transit. I expected Midtown to be dead as a doornail. It was jamming. I mean, every restaurant was packed. There were people reconvening with their colleagues, people out to lunch, people grabbing cocktails. So what it suggested to me is that the city's role, not only as a place to live and work, but as a convening ground, that was the thing that was really coming back quickly. I think the big driver of this, of course, is the young folks. I think that cities have always been a great place for young people. It's where you come to make your career, get opportunity, build your network, find people to date and mate. And at the margin, those rents go down a little bit more. Then people can go 2-3 roommates and get a nice place and establish their career in New York. So yeah, I think that reset is important. I'm just worried about every other time we've predicted this, whether that was after the tragedy of 9/11, whether that was after the financial crisis of 2008. We said, oh, there's an affordability moment. Prices kicked up again very quickly. And so I don't want to say this is a big worry now. There's a big inventory overhang. But my little bit of a worry is we talk about this 3 years from now, New York is again very, very unaffordable.
Yeah, and I'm going to want to go back to that. But first, to your point, which is interesting, right? We have the apartments are filling back up, restaurants are filling back up. What we haven't seen fill back up are the office buildings. If you look at most of the office buildings in Midtown are still, let's call them 20% occupied, even though tenants are paying rent. And when we talk to the CEOs of these companies, they're all inclined to bring their teams back between now and sometime in September. But you talk to a lot of these employees, they don't want to come back. They've been getting comfortable at home. They're a little bit calcified, right? They've been home for working remotely for a long period of time. How do you think this tug of war ends in terms of the companies wanting to bring back their employees and the employees pulling back on that or pushing back on that?
I think it's a subtle, nuanced, and medium run adjustment. Look, I'm calcified, and I'm a pretty ambitious, pretty hard going, charging guy. It's been nice to be home with my two girls. You kind of lose, when I had to pack a bag last week, It usually take me 5 minutes. It took me an hour to find a DOP kit to this and to that. It's hard for people. And again, I'm a hard charging person, for people who you get into a routine. The routine just becomes nice. You go for your walk, you go for your run, you do your Zooms. I'm not saying people, but they get into this routine, spend time with the family. It's hard to readjust. And then, of course, with the issue in New York, I think that there are still some people who are a little bit nervous about the mass transit, whether that's a railroad commute, a PATH commute, a railroad to the subway commute. There's something that's called, it's not the building per se they're scared of. They might even like to go back to the office. It's something in there. So I think it's going to be a subtle and nuanced. I do think it's hard to do in the summer, especially in August. August is a time people are used to kind of doing a vacation deal. I think by September, October, we start to see a recalibration. And then as it gets colder, people, they kind of want to get back with their life. But I think it's going to be gradual. Where we see back to the office bigger is, of course, the Sunbelt cities. If you track it in the Dallases, the Houstons, there is more back to the office in those cities, but they are more driving cities, right? And they have fewer restrictions. And I can't help but think, I said this with regard to Miami. I think one of the things which were necessary, but penalized, I don't want to make a federal case about this, penalized New York or San Francisco or Boston was the heavy restrictions. I think in the communities that had less restriction, whether you agree with that or not, people got used to dealing with the virus and getting out and about more. Where there's been heavy restrictions, heavier lockdowns, that's been harder. So I think all of it means probably by mid-fall, we'll start to see the beginnings of an uptick.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a good point about the heavy restrictions, because it's much more anxiety provoking when you have been away from the office for as long as you have been. And now as you're coming back, I think the other thing that, as I talk to CEOs, is really them trying to hypothesize is what is the future of the workplace, right? I mean, the genie's out of the bottle. We've learned that you can use video conferencing and work remotely effectively for some things, but also how important it is to bring people back to the office, and trying to figure out what's the right model to find the right balance between letting people work remotely and enhancing their quality of life and avoiding the commute, with getting them back to the office for that engagement with their peers, and building social capital and collaboration and mentorship. What's your take as to where we think that goes, this hybrid work model in the future?
Well, we have pretty good data. And again, surveys in the heat of battle are not perfect, but the people who do these surveys are pretty capable economists. What are they saying? About 5% or less of workdays were done remotely pre-pandemic, and about 20% of workdays will be done remotely post-pandemic. Now, of course, that's skewed. It's not essential workers. They have to be face-to-face contact. They have to be doing things directly. So that's more of our workforce, professional, knowledge, creative workforce. But 20% means that 80% of people are still going to go to work. And I think the big thing is I think we kind of conceived of cities wrongly all along. We kind of dumped the world into two buckets. You work in an office in a city, and you live either in a city or a suburb, and you commute to work. But I think what cities have always been around about is connection. It's not work and live. Of course, you work in a city or you live in a city, but what the real role of the city is, why it's a spur of innovation, why it's a spur of creativity, is its connection. And, sociologists have a word for this. They call it a third place. Work is the first place, home is the second. I think I got that right? Or vice versa. Home and work, 1 and 2. And then the third place is the cafe, the restaurant. But now we've invented a whole new category, a co-working facility, a convening facility, a meeting facility. When I stayed at the hotel in Soho, they had 3 kind of different rooms. They had a rooftop, they had a restaurant and a cafe. All 3 of those rooms were booked out 3 times a day for events. You couldn't even get your coffee. You had to fight the event crowd. It seems to me that the role of city is going to be like Rome, going back to Rome. It's a place of convening, of connecting. Not that they'll still be working in offices, there'll still be residents, but I think the big opportunity space, and I'm going to run an idiotic idea by you. In a way, we all can learn something from, of all places, Las Vegas. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous. Las Vegas, it's glitzy, it's glamour, it's whatever, it's fake. But you think about what Las Vegas did as its business model. It really doesn't host many industries. It created a convening and connection and conventioning point. Now, but I think a New York is a better model for that. It has more restaurants and more third places and more cafes and more galleries, more neighborhoods. I think that's what our adjustment's going to be. Slowly but surely, we're going to have great places to work, great places to live. But this third place is going to get even better. And I think there's great opportunities for revival, and there's great business opportunities there too.
Yeah, and I think when you think about New York versus Las Vegas, you have that authenticity, that character, that diversity that's naturally embedded in the community of New York too. You know, the you talk about this third place, and one thing that's interesting to me is thinking about the future of the workplace. And I like to look at parallels as to what happened with e-commerce and retail. When people began to buy stuff online, they'd say, well, why do I want to go to a mall unless it's convenient to get to, or when I'm there, I'm having a great experience. It's an outing. It's a place to go and engage with other people. And the same thing is true for the workplace. Why not work remotely at home, instead of going to the office, unless it's convenient to get to the office? You're going to a place that's energizing, a building that's got character, a community that's got lots of things to do, and people walking around, and restaurants, and a livelihood to it. And so it's almost going to require a curation of that workplace and those communities. And I think more and more we're seeing a flight to quality of the buildings and communities that are best situated to actually be magnetic, just like you would need for retail, will be the ones that outperform. Do you think that's something that is a continuum in a post-COVID and continues to accelerate in that regard?
Yeah, I think there will be a flight to quality. I think in the retail end, it's really interesting. I spend the winters in Miami, and whether you look at Bal Harbour Mall or the Design District, that's what they've become. They've not become shopping centers. They've become places that because Miami doesn't have the neighborhoods of New York, they've become places people meet, and they have lunch, and they have business meetings, and it's really much more about the experience of going there and meeting with people than occasionally run in and grab a shirt. But it's not about shopping per se. I think New York has the capacity to do that at a very terrific level. But the other thing that I find very interesting is work is different now. And I think it was trending this way. When I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, I started to talk about the people taking off their tie, like you're dressed now or like I'm dressed. I started talking about how when I would go visit a high-tech company, it didn't look like, what I'm saying, a Wall Street firm or a Pittsburgh bank. There is something about this blurring of working and living that's happening. And it's not just casualness. I don't have the right word for it, but people want to work in a way that it's more relatable. They don't want to feel stiff. They don't want to feel formal. They want to get together. They want to exchange ideas. And maybe that's the nature of this idea economy. So I think the spaces are changing. They're not as stiff. They're not as formal. The dining room's more casual. The cafe's more relaxed. You grab your coffee. So I think what we're seeing is different kinds of work requiring different kinds of environments. This kind of collaborative work requires a lot of on-site, not all on-site, but the kind of work that's focused requires retreat. And I think we're going to see better definition of that as we come out of the pandemic.
We had David Arena on the show, the global head of real estate for JP Morgan, and he was talking similarly about the importance of rethinking about what remote work means. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to work at home. It means working closer to home, so you get the convenience of not having to commute, be there if you have to do something for a family or errands, but that you go to a remote satellite office with your peers that still helps build the culture of the organization and give you the productivity and tools to be able to excel in that environment. And if that's the case, when you think about CBDs and places like New York, I mean, do you think there's this spreading sort of a regional approach where you have the suburban and urban strategies working in a more coordinated fashion?
I think the greatest thing about cities right now, I wrote about this in City Lab, is the death and life of the central business district. Jane Jacobs, great Jane Jacobs, what was her first essay? Downtowns are for people. Downtowns are for people. Downtowns aren't for companies. Downtowns aren't for factories. Downtowns are for people. Well, this is in 1957 or something. She wrote that 4 years before she wrote Death and Life of Great American Cities. Just walking around Midtown suggests to me that this has the possibility of being the most vibrant neighborhood in the universe. And not because there's great office towers there. Many of those office towers will stay great office towers. Some will be renovated and made even better. Some might be converted, but to residential. But I think the central business district becomes the convening ground. And look, you know this better than me. Why? It's where the transport comes into. It's the easiest place to get to. And if you're near Grand Central or you're near Port Authority or near the financial district, it's easier to get there than most of the parts. So lots of people can come in. Also, in a place like New York, there's 3 great airports. So people can come in from lots of other places. I think the central business, I wrote this in the essay. The central business district is no longer a collection of office towers. Now, this has been happening for the past 20 years, and you know this. The central business district is the office. It's not the tower that's the office. It's the cafes, it's the restaurants, it's the bustle, it's the hustle, it's the vibe, it's the density. And I think the remaking of the central business district, if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have said, boy, oh boy, doesn't Soho and Tribeca and the Village look great? And of course they look great. Now, if you ask me today, I would say Midtown. I would have never said this a year ago, 18 months ago. Midtown looks to me like it could be a really spectacular mixed use live, work, play neighborhood in a way that I never pictured it. I missed it. And so I think the future of the central business district, or in New York's case, the central business districts, maybe there's 3 with Brooklyn now, it could be quite spectacular.
Well, and one thing that's interesting to this point is we've seen a model like this in New York, in Lower Manhattan after 9/11, where it was the quintessential 9 to 5, 5 days a week. You took the train in, you were in an office building, and it wasn't about the community. Post 9/11, reimagined to a live, work, play 24/7 community. And now you walk downtown and you have the parks and baby carriages and playgrounds and a whole different level of energy that creates the ecosystem that you were referring to in Midtown. And as you said, these things have been happening. Or COVID just accelerated so much so quickly. And I guess one of the concerns I have is you have some of these obsolete buildings in Midtown, whether they're office buildings or hotels. And, this, the question is, how do we accelerate some of that creative destruction? And I don't know if you've seen any policies or ways to actually make that happen more quickly to get to that final vision that you described.
I think you made a really important point, especially as a dad of 2 young kids. Parks really mean a lot to families. I mean, if you're going to support family living, you need schools, which now are in Lower Manhattan, and you need parks because people are living in apartments. So that's important. And maybe Midtown has access to parks, but maybe it needs more pocket parks. If you look at the history of deindustrialization, that's my second point. Many of the buildings were reused. The beautiful buildings in Soho, the cast iron buildings, the beautiful old factories in Tribeca, but some of them weren't, and they were knocked down. And so in the long sweep, there are going to be certain of those buildings, again, given what you do for a living, you're going to know which they are. Certain of those buildings will be spectacular as high-end office and convening facility, and they have history and they're spectacular buildings. Others of those buildings can be converted into residential, which is arduous, but can be done. Others of them may have been past their useful shelf life, and then they would be taken down. It seems to me, I don't have a specific policy in mind. It seems to me that this is where the US is very good at establishing federal, state, local partnership, but public-private partnership. One of the things we've done very well in the US in rebuilding our cities is public-private partnership. Where we've got the private sector, the real estate development community, local, state, federal, working together. And in particular, Scott, I want to mention one other thing. When I look at what's worked, not just in New York or San Francisco or Boston, but when I go to Milwaukee or Indianapolis or Columbus or Bentonville or Tulsa, where the universities and medical centers have really been, the anchor institutions have been part of this and real drivers, maybe there's something in that.
Yeah.
Maybe New York's great complex of anchor institutions, medical centers, universities, can be repositioned somehow. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And some of that space, whether it's old buildings or new buildings, can be retrofitted and maybe spread them out a little. Maybe they're overly concentrated. Columbia University, for example, maybe it needs a bigger Midtown presence. NYU, maybe it needs a bigger presence I don't know, but I'm saying there's something in that that might make for a useful strategy for the future of these business districts.
You know, as you bring up education and healthcare, one of the things that we have as a focus on areas that we're going to invest in is we call it eds, meds, and well led, which are where are the places that have good education systems, good healthcare and research institutions, and most importantly, are well led. And that really, I think, is the glue that drives that public-private partnership and policy initiatives that you're speaking of. And again, in our conversation with David Arena, we were talking about the East Side zoning laws that enabled you to upzone around Grand Central and Park Avenue, and how that has sparked them redeveloping their new headquarters and so many new buildings along Park Avenue, as well as new places for people to come and convene, right? And so it's a good example of how public policy itself can be a driver of this positive change, but it comes down to having good leadership that helps orchestrate that public-private partnership.
It's hard to find a place that has better civic leadership than New York. I mean, the interest of the business community, the civic community, the involvement of academic leadership, the intermediary institutions that exist. It is a pretty well-governed place. Is it perfect? No. Are there problems? Yes. But in the scope of things, New York is reasonably well-governed. You know, I want to go back to one thing, though. And this is so hard for someone who's a progressive to say. What really worries me about cities, people talk about taxes. There are two things that worry me. One is the easy one to think about, and that is the perception of rising urban crime and disorder. Now, I wrote about this in the New York Times several years ago in an op-ed called "The Urban Revival is Over." And I said, we have to watch this, that people get scared when they feel unsafe. And I'm not so sure New York is a horribly less safe place than it was, but the perception is that it is. So that's important. The second one is the restrictions. And I think that people in America, in general, just don't like being told what to do. And if they're told what to do too many times, or if they're told their kids can't go to school or the schools can't open, they kind of say, I'm going to move. And I think a big thing that's motivated these red state moves isn't tax rates, Scott. I think people said, I want to put my kids in school. I want to go to a place where I can go outside. I don't want to go and have to be afraid to go out my door. And so I think getting our handles on these two things, crime and disorder, and making sure we can manage whatever phase of the pandemic's left so that we don't shut the school. I'm not saying that's going to happen. Shut the schools or have another round of restrictions, because I think that accelerates the decision process where people say, oh, if I can't do stuff I want to do, I'm either going to move out of the city to a suburb or rural area, I'm going to move away. And those are the two things I think that are the big challenges.
Yeah, another challenge that we focus a lot on is the sort of the rise of the haves and have-nots. And when you think about what happened with COVID, it really shined a spotlight on the number of structural inequities that existed in our many underserved communities, and they bore the brunt of the public health issue, and they're structurally dislocated from this recovery. And at the same time, we have these great companies that are having record stock prices every day, and their businesses are doing better than ever. What actions do you think cities like New York can take to help deal with these inequities and this widening gap that exists? And how can we leverage some of the public-private partnerships that you referred to?
Well, one of the things I talk about in my book, New Urban Crisis, which makes me optimistic about the future of cities, is precisely the fact that cities are diverse, racially, ethnically, and in terms of socioeconomic status. They are not homogeneous communities like many of our gated suburbs, which are all rich people. So that urban politics has to register these claims. If you're a less advantaged person, if you live in a less advantaged neighborhood, you want better services, you want better educational opportunity, you want racial and economic justice. And so I think our cities, and at the same time, our cities have come back. There are many more affluent people. There's businesses with a bigger stake. There's universities and colleges that care about cities. So it forces us in a way that's quite unique And that's what I think gets a lot of the more libertarian parts of the business community, Scott, maybe not like you, upset. Why can't we get our way? Why can't we do what we want? Why do we have to pay attention to homelessness? Why can't we just go about business the old-fashioned way? Because cities are big, diverse places, and they process these claims. So yeah, I think we have to double down on this. Fortunately, we have a presidential regime that is helping, not hurting, because cities can't solve all these problems on their own. They don't have the resources. But it seems to me that it's not just, I think we have a misconception when it comes to inequality, that somehow just material goods and money will solve it. I don't think it will. I think that what people want is opportunity and purpose. And that's what we haven't had the conversation. One time I gave this talk in Sweden about the future of society. And I said, in Sweden, you created the welfare state, the social democratic ideal, giving people more equitable society, but people are still pretty unhappy. They don't just want money. And of course they want to be able to live a life. And they don't just want a decent place. Of course they want a decent place to live. They want purpose and meaning and opportunity. They want their kids to be able to do better than they did. And I think that's what New York could do. Focus on opportunity, but focus on giving these youngsters real purpose and meaning, and figuring out a way, whatever they're interested in, sports, music, a way for them to find a way to define a career or a life doing that. And I think that's where we got to get to.
And the other area that New York has made, part of the ingredients that's made New York special is immigration, right? And then we had this, you spoke about diversity a lot, and our immigrant population in the country and the city has been shrinking because of public policy and now because of public health issues. How do you think that impacts cities like New York as we go forward if there's a dearth of the level of immigrant population that we normally are used to?
Well, there are two big factors in the urban revival in America. One is the movement of highly educated people, or what I called, making air quotes, the creative class, younger professionals, knowledge workers into the city center for opportunity and amenity. But that's actually a smaller piece. The bigger piece is the tremendous wave of immigrants who come to our country, and mostly, some settle in suburbs, but many settle in urban centers, and often where housing is less affordable. So parts of Brooklyn, but parts of Upper Manhattan, large parts of Queens, and large parts of the Bronx. And those immigrant communities, because they're self-selecting for ambition, they're self-selecting for hard work, they're self-selecting for diligence, because they wouldn't immigrate if they didn't, tend to be community stabilizers, right? That's what they do. They stabilize even neighborhoods that were troubled neighborhoods. So yeah, as soon as we get this immigration uptick going again, I think that's going to help with a lot of the urban disorder problems we've seen. It won't solve them all. It also makes a city more diverse, and it breaks down some of the factions and factionalization. It creates diversity. I'll point to Toronto, on this one. They don't call Toronto a melting pot; they call it a mosaic, and that's a really important thing. That you're not supposed to melt into Toronto. You can keep your cultural identity, but have a dual identity as being Canadian and Torontonian.
You reference New York as a superstar city, and I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I'm curious on your take of this, is more of a superstar region, right? That the people that normally would be in the city are bleeding out to the suburbs, and not necessarily your white picket fence suburbs, but the urban suburban downtowns where they're getting the best of the diversity of the architecture, of the character, of the walkability of what a city is, but still close to open space, still close to public transportation back to New York. I wonder if that's also an outlet when you think about trying to help on equality, of a place where more people can live and get the access to the education foundation for opportunity that you were referring to.
Cities grow two ways. They grow by intensifying the use of land. So bigger towers like that are in the back of me, and bigger condo towers and denser residences in and near the core. But they also grow outward. They extensify the use of land. You see that in New York as it grew from a walking city to a streetcar city to a car city. Now, what's interesting about New York is you're bringing some of those rural areas. I think what remote work does really well is enable the boundaries of the metro to include these really cool rural areas, like the Hudson Valley towns that were kind of falling apart, and only ex-hippies and artists and musicians. They're becoming real communities. So it stretches the boundaries of metropolitan areas. And in that way, it keeps the New York metropolitan area more affordable. and creates churn. There's always spaces to use and reuse. So yeah, I think the other thing about New York, which I think most people don't get when you say superstar city, let's look at the ranks of the world superstar city. New York is 1, London is 2, Hong Kong is 3. We can add Tokyo to the mix, and Singapore and Paris. Well, for all of New York's troubles, of all those cities, New York looks best poised to be the world superstar city. It is the most open. It is the most open with regard to immigration. It's not trapped, whether Brexit, it doesn't have to deal with Brexit. It doesn't have to deal with China incursion into Hong Kong. It doesn't have to deal with the homogeneity and the lack of immigration to Japan. It doesn't have to deal with the issues of the EU and Paris. Boy, oh boy, it looks to me like if I want to project out 2 decades, I think New York becomes the world's #1 global city. And when we're talking about those office towers, I think you get more global headquarters in New York. I think that's going to be the thing that people aren't anticipating. If you're a Canadian company, a British company, a French company, a Dutch company, and you're going to have to say, where can I get the best talent? Yeah, London's great, Hong Kong's great, but I think that talent magnetism and diversity and open-mindedness and whatever we think about New York, that's going to make New York the #1 global city. So I think it's going to be the superstar of superstars coming in these next 2 decades in a way we've never seen before.
Yeah. And so one last question for you. So we have had our primary election for the mayor recently in New York, and it looks like Eric Adams is in position to become New York City's next mayor. And in fairness to him, to some of your points, he's focused on public safety as a priority for his administration. But if you had the opportunity to sit down and chat with him and give him a couple of ideas of things he should do, in his first 100 days in office, what would they be?
So I think job one right now has to be not just public safety, but dealing with urban disorder. There is something that has happened in this vacuum created by COVID where the risk oblivious have come back to life first, and where there's a reality and a perception that cities are chaotic and have disorders. So it's not just more, it is better policing and reform policing, but it's dealing with the causes of disorder, stronger nonprofits, stronger neighborhood associations, stronger bids. I think that is job 1, maybe job 2 and 3. Figuring out what to do with transit. And I'm not an expert in transit, but if transit is no longer just a way to get suburban dormitory worker residents into downtown offices, but transit has changed, thinking about what that means, dealing with, I hear, now you'd know better, I hear that that automotive traffic is already starting to exceed pre-pandemic heights. That terrifies me. The kind of gridlock that you would see, and we know that congestion is something that destroys the dynamism of cities. And then I think we've gotten a reprieve, a little bit of a reprieve with the issues of affordability, but keeping that eye on that, because I think in the next 3, 4, 5 years, the affordability is not going to be there. And I wouldn't get distracted with all this bullshit about the decline in New York. I don't buy it for a minute. I would just say, don't even worry about that. New York is the greatest city in the world. It's going to be great. Maybe, as a 5th priority, thinking about internationalization, globalization, what that means for the city as it becomes more of a global finance center, a global real estate center, a global tech center. And then lastly, how to manage the technology thing. Well, I mean, it is clear to me, there's, our friend Steve Case talks about the rise of the rest and the rise of Pittsburgh and Nashville and Indianapolis as tech hubs. When you look at the rise of the rest for real, and we can put Austin and Miami, the rise of the rest technology center is called New York City. I mean, you can take all the rest of them together, Miami, Austin, Pittsburgh, Dallas, add them all up, and they don't add up to New York, right? It's San Francisco's here, and then New York's here, ahead of Boston, ahead of LA, ahead of Seattle. Thinking about what that means, really, as New York becomes one of the world's top 5. Think about this. You've never thought this. What does it mean when New York is a top 5 or top 3 high technology startup hub, and how best to manage that in the fabric of what New York is today?
Yeah. And I want to react to your comment on public transit, because, my view on that and spending a lot of time is similar to how you describe people getting re-comfortable with the office again, is that as people start returning to public transit, and I take the subway, our teams take commuter rails, the more people that are on the system, the less there is for issues, the less there's perception issues. And I think over time, as people come back to the city, that will work itself through, particularly when the alternative is to sit in traffic like you described.
Look, economic theory tells us one thing. Cities grow as long as they can increase the velocity of moving people, goods, and ideas. As they congest, the velocity of moving people, goods, and ideas slows down. The one thing that could, in addition to crime, that could hurt New York's prospect is that velocity of moving people, goods, and ideas slows down sufficiently to damage New York's urban metabolism. So yeah, keeping that going is a big priority.
And Richard, as usual, you have a great breadth of ideas. But one theme that I think that sort of spreads across everything that you spoke about was the need, as we get to this new normal, is to be intentional, right? That we have to be intentional about people feeling comfortable in public transit, intentional about making our workplaces and our neighborhoods more activated, more energizing, more magnetic than they would be before, intentional on trying to put in the foundation to help the people that are in the underserved communities have the education and the opportunities that others would have. So it's the theme, I think, coming to new normal is intentionality.
Yeah, let me just end on this. I think we've lacked intentionality. I really do. You know, I've been saying this since March of 2020. We need to focus and put the epidemiologists and the infectious disease experts and medical professionals on dealing with the pandemic. But there's a bunch of people who are experts in urbanism in cities, and you need to empower them to figure out the path forward to reopening and recovery. It's like planning for natural disaster. You got to stabilize, you got to clean things up, you got to get going, and you need an intentional strategy for recovery. And in this case, a recovery that's not only vibrant, but it's inclusive and resilient and sustainable. We have not done that. So I think one of the big postmortems we need after this pandemic disaster is to figure out how in the future we can be more intentional from the get-go. Like we have to pay attention because, you know, I'm a road cyclist. It's so funny. If you don't look where you're going, you'll go where you're looking. Think about that. If you don't look where you're going, you'll go where you're looking. That's exactly what happens to cities. If you don't figure out where you want to go, good luck. And I think we've minimized that. That said, look, there's been a better dialogue about New York's recovery and New York's future than in most other cities. Maybe one thing New York could do for other places is help other places understand how to be even more intentional and strategic about their future.
Richard, thank you for taking the time, sharing your thoughts and your leadership on thinking about the future of cities and the creative class, and getting us all to expand our own thinking as we go through these new normal times that we have to navigate for the first time together. So thank you so much for taking time. Really appreciate it and enjoy it.
Thank you, Scott.
That concludes this week's episode of Recalibrate Reality. A New York that is more prosperous, more sustainable, and more equitable than before doesn't just happen. We need to be intentional in creating a world that addresses many of our region's challenges. And as we've heard throughout this series, it requires bold and innovative thinking, and of course, working together. This interview marks the 26th interview of Recalibrate Reality. Stay tuned for new episodes starting in September. Thank you again to Richard Florida. Thank you to the Regional Plan Association, the 92nd Street Y, and to the team for making this week's episode possible. I'm Scott Rechler from 75 Rockefeller Plaza in New York. See you in a few weeks.